Hello and welcome to our new episode of our introductory series to Rome 2 Total War. Today we are going to talk about spearmen and how to use them properly with their tricks and tips. First off, the spearmen are represented with this 3 spear symbol. It's very easy to recognize. And the moment you see them, you must remember that you must not use your cavalry against them, but you should use your swordsmen in order to counter them. Whenever you want to use them in the battle during the deployment phase, there are multiple ways to deploy them. They are very flexible in that way. If you see at the deployment phase, you can deploy them however you want. I prefer to deploy them in like this. Slightly open line, not too thick, not too thin, to cover enough area, but not too weak. The beginning doesn't really matter because your opponent will be way too far for his cavalries to reach before you can react. And when you see your opponent coming, always consider how heavy are his cavalries. For example, if he's using heavy cataphracts, which are the heaviest, maybe after the elephants, you should try to keep them in a tight formation, assuming that he's charging on you. Majority of times in the multiplayer, your opponent is not going to charge on your spears, but let's say that happened, you should keep them in this tight formation, and if you still have the time, you should use the shield screen ability. The shield screen ability increases the damage versus cavalry. It gives bracing, basically reduces enemies' charge bonus. It increases the melee defense and shield strength. It basically makes you much more defensible, but you cannot move, as you can see from the tooltip. The other ability that these units have, it depends on the faction. For example, right now I'm playing Germania. Cavalry counter tactics. As you can see, it is pretty much a anti-cavalry ability, but not only that, it increases melee defense and weapon damage, also gives you bracing, so you can also use it while fighting anything else. The Romans have an alternative, two alternative abilities, which is fast advance. It increases your charge speed. I think it was intended for use for chasing the enemy cavalry, which I do not suggest you using. And the other one is square formation. It also gives you bracing. I think it still allows you to move though, and then the defensive testudo, pretty much the same thing as the shield screen, but a little bit more cooler. Um, as I mentioned, these units are counter cavalry units, and the counter for the spearmen is swordsman. So you should keep that trio in mind. The rest of it, well, it depends on the details, and you can learn that over time. But for the basics, you should remember that. Also, if you're fighting against elephants, try to keep a very tight formation, especially if he's charging on you. And if you have your archers ready, switch to fire arrows, because fire arrows scare elephants, and when elephants are scared, they can go berserk. At that moment, you can just withdraw. Your opponent will lose control of his elephants, and then you can consider that unit dead, because as far as I see it, they don't recover from it. As I've already talked about the abilities in these units. The interesting thing about these units, as I mentioned, you should not use these units to chase the enemy cavalry, but instead keep them in a very defensive formation. Never forget, spearmen are a defensive unit. They are not meant to chase the enemy. For example, let's say our general here is a ranged unit, such as maybe an archer, maybe a slinger. Now, if you see your opponent cavalry coming from here, you should always counter him. And let's say your starting position is here, you should move your spears right over here and your archers right behind them. You should not try to chase your enemy, because it is usually a bait, or they can simply just change their tactics, because cavalries have the advantage of speed and mobility. However, spearmen have the advantage of distance. That means you can just, with 2 clicks, you can counter cavalry charge. The first click is for your ranged units, just move them somewhere away from the path of the enemy cavalry, and just move in the spearmen. If your enemy is using lots of light cavalry and is spreading them out, you can also open your ranks. The moment they touch, the cavalry will be considered engaged, and they will begin to refuse the orders. However, any expert player will just click many times on his target unit and will just break through your line. So you should, even if you are engaging your enemy, unless you're holding him, like in a position like this where your opponent is somewhere around here, you should still move your unit away, because even a few cavalry can create huge problems for ranged units. Always keep that in mind. Always try to practice to cover your ranged units or your flanks if you, let's say, don't have any ranged units, or if your enemy is trying to make an hammer and anvil. Try to stop his hammer with your spearmen, and he will have no chance in doing so. Even if he does try that, he will lose tons of his cavalry, and they will probably rout. And with the latest, with the patch 4, I think, the morale reduction for routes is gonna be doubled, meaning you can rout your opponent much easier, and you must protect your units much harder this time. Which I think that is a good development. And the also, and not to mention, the pikemen can also kill the spearmen, obviously, and the ranged units are also effective against spearmen. It depends on their armor, obviously. Archers can usually kite the enemy, so you again should not chase your opponent with spearmen. It is never a good idea, unless in the extreme cases where enemy cavalry is dead and you have excess amount of melee infantry. In that case, you can still use your spears, but at least use them to flank the enemy, because these guys are not good on one-on-one combat versus sword infantry. So you should at least try to flank your enemy and get them a morale reduction. Yeah, that's pretty much it about the spearmen. If you have any ideas, or if you think I skipped anything, please leave it on the comments.